Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So, as the title of the video should tell you, I'm going to be talking about the Marshall-Caster divide and how it relates to 1D&D. Now, if you don't know what the Marshall-Caster divide is, there's a common opinion amongst the optimization community that spellcasters, particularly mages, are more powerful than the marshals or warriors in the game. And what it largely comes down to is, we look at the things that spells can accomplish with your action versus what you can accomplish by, say, attacking with a weapon as your action. And we see that spells can often do just as much damage as the weapon, but they can also do so many more things. Things that might even be more effective, like control effects and that kind of thing. So there's this belief, and I share it to some degree, that in D&D, casters are just more powerful than non-casters. Now, the reason why I'm doing this video is because I get a lot of questions about 1D&D, and they often start with something like, given that the Marshall-Caster divide is now greater than ever in 1D&D, and then they go on to ask the question. Well, I can't really answer those questions because they're loaded questions. A loaded question is a question that contains an assumption that it shouldn't be making. And the assumption that it's making, of course, is that the Marshall-Caster divide is greater than ever. Now, in order for me to explain why I don't agree with that assumption, first I kind of have to talk about 1D&D in general. So when the very first playtest came out, the very first video I did, I kind of went through it, and I said in the video, in fact, I titled the video that this is looking like 6th edition. Now, I got a lot of pushback about that, and I brought it up again since, and I've still had a fair amount of pushback. The idea is that this is more of a 5.5 because, the skeleton of the game is basically remaining the same, and this just isn't kind of the change you've seen from like 4th edition to 5th edition. I just can't get on board with this being a 5.5 edition. And really what it comes down to is we only have 1.5 edition in D&D, and that was 3.5. Now, when 3rd edition came out, I played it, and then when 3.5 came out, very shortly after, I got the Player's Handbook right away, flipped through it, and I basically wanted to see what they had changed. And I, with a bit of hunting, found that there was obviously a couple classes that people have been complaining about being too weak. Rangers and bards come to mind. So they boosted those up. Then they had a couple spells that were problematic, and they redesigned those so that they worked. Same thing with some feats. Some feats got rebalanced. But if you go through these two books, they're almost the same. There are changes, but far and away, if you look at it, it's a copy and paste. The 3.5 is really just kind of a big errata to 3rd edition, which is why they called it 3.5. Now, if we look at like 1st edition becoming 2nd edition, well, in that case, we have changes to the game that are actually smaller than what we're seeing with 1D&D compared to 5th edition so far. But there's no question that 2nd edition is just an entire rewrite of 1st edition. It's not copied and pasted at all. So it does qualify as a new edition. Now, when it comes to 1D&D, what I would say is there's no way that this could qualify, in my opinion, as a 0.5 edition. Now, the designers can always just tell you. They can say, this is 6th edition or this is 5.5, and we would all agree, okay, well, if that's what they call it, that's what they call it. But in this case, of course, the designers haven't told us. They say this is 1D&D, this is the D&D, and they kind of talk about it like D&D has never changed other than in small ways. No, D&D's had some pretty major changes. And if we were to look at 5th edition compared to what we've seen so far in 1D&D, I think this qualifies as a new edition for two main reasons. The first is the quantity of changes, and the second is the severity of changes. So if we look at the quantity of changes, we saw the first play test, and what did we see? Well, they took every race in the Player's Handbook, and they either told us those races aren't going to be in the new Player's Handbook, here's new races that will be, or one new race that will be, And here's every other race. And here's the new rules for all of those races. Every single one of them got changed. Then they said, here are your first level feats. Now, getting a first level feat in itself is a change. But also, a lot of these feats were based on existing feats. And other than, I think it was just the tough feat, all of them had been changed or were new entirely. Then they told us there were a bunch of changes through the rules glossary. Now, we get this second playtest, and what happens? Well, we're going to look at 3 classes. Did any of those classes remain the same? No, all 3 were changed, and they all had several changes. They also all included a subclass. That was a subclass that was in the original Player's Handbook, and none of those are the same. All of those have changed too. This is a 100% change rate for classes and subclasses, and as we go into the next 3, presumably, playtests that will include all the rest of the classes, my prediction would be, and if you don't agree, let me know, but my prediction would be every class is being changed and every subclass is being changed. Now, like I said, if you don't think that's the case, I'd love to hear why you think that, based on what we've seen so far. We also got a whole bunch of 4th level feats, like 30 4th level feats in this document. These were pretty much rewrites of existing feats, and by rewrites, I mean almost none of them were the same. There were a couple, like there was Resilient comes to mind, was the same, but for the most part, they were all changed. And then we got a huge rules glossary revision with, again, tons more changes. And these are just the first 2 playtests. It really looks like they're taking section by section, going through the Player's Handbook, and then they pull it up, and then every little thing is either being changed or they're thinking, why wouldn't we change this? And so we're getting little nuggets of things that are staying the same rather than little nuggets of things that are being changed. The second reason I think this is a new edition, though I think the first reason is enough, but the second reason I think this is a new edition is some of these changes are severe. So if we look at losing the -5 +10 mechanic, for example, from Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter, these are severe changes. Because, like, if you look at optimized builds, like, if you play in optimized groups, anyone who's using a weapon, there's a really good chance they have those feats or one of those feats, and they use that -5 +10 mechanic as central to the build. Now, removing those and not replacing them with anything else as of yet means that all those players are now looking at no option for those kinds of builds. And it changes how damage is going to work in the game. Damage just came way down. Now, I did a first impressions video where I looked at the rogue and I said, the rogue's been gutted. But you know what? When I did that first impressions video, we looked at it in order. And then once I had time to go through the entire document and had time to think about it, well, then I had to think, sneak attack is undeniably worse than it was, objectively worse. However, we're seeing other ways to increase damage being eliminated entirely or just nerfed to oblivion. So now when I'm looking at ways to increase my weapon damage, in comparison, like when you take sneak attack and you bring it down to here, and then you take sharpshooter, which was way up here, and then you bring it all the way down to here, suddenly sneak attack ain't looking so bad anymore. In fact, it might even look better in comparison. And this is because of context, and we are just missing so much context right now. And this context is really important when we're going to talk about the Martial Caster Divide. So the whole reason for talking about this being a new edition in a Martial Caster Divide video is I just want to explain that as far as I can see, this game is getting really changed. And these playtests are showing bigger changes than I just ever expected. And so it makes it so I don't know what to expect for the rest. So if you are going to ask me about a Martial Caster Divide, let's say you were designing 6th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and then you came to me as a consultant and you said, Martial Caster Divide has always been an issue in D&D, and I'm curious if you think my new edition is making it better or worse. Well, what I would probably do is the very first thing I'd do is I'd look at the spells. And then I'd probably look at the weapon damage chart. And then I would probably look at, the mage classes. And then I'd probably look at the warrior classes. Now, I'd look at more than that, but those would definitely be the first 4 things I would look at. Well, we haven't seen a mage packet yet, or a warrior packet yet. We haven't seen the weapon damage chart yet. We have not seen the spells yet. We've seen 2 spells. We saw Guidance and Barkskin, and reading those spells, neither of them gave me the idea, gee, I guess weapons are useless. Like if you thought you read Guidance or Barkskin and it just gave you the idea that, well, I guess martials just got nerfed to oblivion compared to casters, I would love to hear why. So with all that information not available yet, I wasn't sure I understood why this common reaction that the martial caster divide was greater than ever. And I had a conversation with a patron about that. And this patron firmly believes that the martial caster divide has already been determined to be greater than ever. And I just wasn't quite sure, but I really tried to think about why would somebody think that? And it occurred to me, are they just using all the gaps in 1D&D and just filling it in with 5th edition? So I asked, and I quote, "Is it your belief, after seeing the changes we've seen so far to feats, races, rules, and classes, that the spells of 5th edition will be a relevant marker for what we should expect from the spells in 1D&D? And his answer was, yes, I believe so. Now he gave a reason why he had that response. And he said, well, the designers of Dungeons & Dragons have told us that 1D&D is basically going to be 5th edition with some tweaks, with some added things and some improvements. So based on what they've said, if we take them at their word, then the spells in 5th edition should be an accurate marker for what we can expect in 1D&D. And, I can't disagree with that, but what I would say is that if I look at Playtest 1 and Playtest 2, to me it's clear that that's not what's happening. But that's the difference, right? Because if you can fill in all those puzzle pieces with what 5th edition is now, and you just assume Packet 1 and Packet 2, these are flukes. These are basically the changes we're going to see, and for the rest of D&D, we're not going to see the same treatment. We're just going to see a few tweaks here and there, but overall, it's going to be the same. Spells are basically going to be the same. If I look at Conjure Animals, they might tweak, the range or something, but I'll still be able to get my 8 Velociraptors with it. Well, yeah, then I get it. Then I get why the martial caster divide is greater than ever. However, based on what I've seen, I don't agree. I mean, if I look at Conjure Animals, yeah, it's a super powerful spell, does a ton of damage, and creates a lot of what is the martial caster divide. But what if spells like that all get the same treatment that Sharpshooter did? Just imagine that for a moment. What if your next character that you want to focus on Eldritch Blast can't do it with a 2-level Warlock dip? Consider that for a moment. Consider if Agonizing Blast only gets applied to 1 attack per round. Now, I don't know that any of these things are happening, but I think these are all fairly reasonable predictions. However, that doesn't mean even more severe stuff might not happen. Like, we haven't seen the weapon damage chart yet. Is it all going to remain the same? Maybe. I think it is unlikely we'll see any severe changes to that. However, I don't think it's off the table. I don't think it is off the table that weapons might do different damage than we've seen in 5th edition. Another thing I don't think is off the table is the rules for spellcasting. Like, will the rules for spellcasting be more limiting and severe? They could be. Again, I'm not predicting that, but it's possible. So if we are to assume that the puzzle really hasn't been filled in, and we can't just take our current 5th edition rules and fill in those gaps, because this is an entirely new edition, well then, the martial caster divide at this point is just undetermined. It may be that it is greater than it ever has been before. It may be smaller than it ever has been before. Or it might be the same as it currently has been. And as those puzzle pieces get filled in, certainly I will be talking about it and I will be making more bold predictions. But for now, I just don't think that anyone has enough information to be making those determinations. But if you think the Marshall-Caster divide has gotten bigger than ever, or if you think that maybe we need more information before making that determination, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.